Well, there's a strong chance that as you join me on Newsfeed, you're joining me from a city. I'm sure you've been watching the situation in most of our cities, not all of them, but most of them really deteriorating. Water problems, electricity problems, general crumbling of infrastructure. The African Centre for Cities is looking at how to improve leadership in our cities and how to improve the leadership by mayors in cities across the continent. The Centre has been running a leadership program under the African Mayoral Leadership Initiative. Professor Edgar Pieterse is the founding director of the African Centre for Cities. Professor, good afternoon to you and thanks for your time. When you try to improve the leadership skills of mayors, what kind of skills are you looking at?
Thank you, Stephen. There's a very simple idea at the core of this program, and that is this notion of adaptive leadership. And this comes from the belief that there are two categories of competence that effective mayors need to master. On the one hand, it is to know what is within your formal authority that is derived from legal statutes, from whatever is empowered at the municipal level. But then the secondary one is leadership, and these two things are completely different. What authority is good for is to understand what is within your power, what are technical problems that you can marshal the administration or whatever technical expertise around to solve. But most of the problems that our cities face is what one could call wicked problems. These are such knotty, interdependent challenges that they don't lend themselves to easy technical fixes. And what you have to do is to be able to communicate a compelling vision about how to address that wicked problem, why people need to band together, why you need to aggregate resources, skills, competencies, and so forth, and then move together in a shared direction. Now, that requires the exercise of leadership. And what we see is that often we have mayors who understand authority, but they do not know how to combine that with the exercise of leadership. And it is that distinction that lives at the heart of this program, because we believe that any mayor can access any technical expertise they may need, but that the real challenge is to get them to understand what leadership looks like and how to exercise that in a way that is inclusive and that is compelling.
So, to think of an example off the top of my head, say, for example, in almost any big city outside the Western Cape, you could say, potholes is a big problem. We want to fix potholes in our city. It's going to take a long time to do it. It's unlikely that your area will be treated first, but I need your help for me to treat the neighboring area before I come to you. Would that be an example?
So that would really be a technical problem. So, of course, potholes, the reasons why they exist and why they persist is a combination of long-term underinvestment in road maintenance, poorly run roads agencies, intensified weather events. That means that what may have been a maintenance schedule that requires refurbishment every 3 or 4 years now needs to be done every 2 years. That's a technical problem. Of course, when you have a condition where you've got a perfect storm like you have in Gauteng, both metaphorically and literally, where, of course, where potholes are symptomatic of much larger systemic and institutional failure, then I think we're talking about what we have in mind. Because what that means is that you've got to recognize the limits of your authority, that you will need people to be patient, that you will need various actors to come in to do, if you will, patchwork exercises until you can have a more systemic solution. But most importantly, a good mayor, good city leaders are able to take really difficult problems and transform them into a source of collective action so that people feel part of the story of the city, they feel there's an opportunity to contribute, and that they're all in it together. I think if you look at where we are in many South African cities, we're miles away from that scenario. Everyone is pointing fingers, everyone is blaming, and everyone feels someone else is responsible for the problem. There's very little evidence of a shared inheritance that we've got to collectively solve.
One of the problems, Professor Pieterse, it seems to me, is that our politics in South Africa, but in lots of other places actually, has all become about blaming someone else. Some people call it identity politics. That's probably an oversimplification. What I'm trying to get to is, it seems to me to be quite tempting, particularly in city administrations. We've seen it in Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, that you just blame your opponent, so you don't fix things for everybody. And I understand why that is, because it's much easier to do than to fix the problems you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is, the crisis we sit with in terms of the political maturity, specifically in the South African context, because as long as that's going to continue, we will, of course, in aggregate, standards of living will fall the economy will fail for everyone, and we will effectively be running down the remaining assets that we may still have in the public domain and in terms of infrastructure. So it's obviously a strategy where you are effectively, sort of cutting off your own nose to spite your opponent's face, to twist that metaphor. But yeah, it's really short-sighted, and I think it's symptomatic of the paucity of mature politics and mature leadership in our specific context.
It's also becoming just harder to manage cities, isn't it? I mean, you've got more and more people moving into cities. I mean, that's probably almost a universal problem. You've got people moving in quite quickly. In fact, you've got climate change. You've perhaps got fewer resources after COVID-19 on our continent. It seems to me that to be a mayor now is probably harder than it's been in many, many years.
It is very difficult, and of course outside of South Africa and to some extent in South Africa, being a mayor is regarded as a junior political role. So you're not as important as a governor or premier, and definitely not as important as a minister. And this is a very sort of sad political cultural fact, because actually the job of a mayor is probably 10 times more complex and demanding than that of a minister, because typically any minister has one thematic portfolio they've got to look at, and they tend to have a lot more resources at their disposal to help them manage that function. Whereas a typical mayor have 10, 12, 15 ministers who rain down competing and often contradictory demands on them, and they do that without providing them the requisite resources to, in fact, implement what they are being asked of. So absolutely, this is a very demanding and a thankless job. But I think at the same time, what we've seen in other parts of the world is that cities hold the key to economic competitiveness. They hold the key to building robust innovation systems that is going to drive low-carbon green economies. And of course, they hold the key to building vibrant cultural and multicultural identities. And if you're in a mayor, you're in this unique position to really harness these disparate resources and agendas, and they are considerable in cities just because that's where the economy is anchored. So if you are smart about it, you can in fact build a really compelling narrative and create exciting programs for people to rally around. But this again comes to why we are doing this program. That opportunity is not going to materialize unless you have people who understand what leadership involves, and for them to come to the fore and build those inclusive social narratives.
Such an interesting point that you made, that on our continent it seems that mayors are seen as sort of junior people who want to go into national politics. I mean, in some countries, people have made such a big name for themselves just by being a mayor. I mean, New York had Michael Bloomberg, had another mayor at one time, whose name I forget now. You had, in London, people still talk about Ken Livingstone.
Giuliani's name.
Sorry?
Did you forget Rudy's name?
Yes, deliberately. And then you've also got someone like Ken Livingstone in London, for example, who just said, yes, I could be a member of parliament, and he was for a while, but I actually just want to focus on London. And people, if you dedicate a career to that, you can change a city. People in those cities will often remember you, and very, very fondly, if you do make a major change.
Absolutely. And of course, the story in Latin America is that often the road to the presidency is through a mayorship in a big city. We've seen this in Colombia, in Mexico, in Chile, and so on. So in Asia, that phenomenon is also coming more strongly to the fore. And again, it speaks to this point that I made, that if you can prove your mettle in a large metropolitan area, you are absolutely fit to run a country, because in some ways running a global metropolitan region is as complex and demanding as running a country. But we still have some ways to go for that to become a political norm in the African context.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time. Professor Edgar Pieterse is the founding director at the African Centre for Cities. So much to talk about when you look at our cities, look at the state of our cities as well.